I think that I was instructed pretty specifically, actually, by the councilwoman who first invited us to back as a company to host the conversation, the Designing a Community Energy Project conversation. She told me, where to publicize the event and how to email out. I learned specific things about people do not want to be BCC'd on emails. They all wanted to know who's on the email chain. Don't BCC me. I want to be able to reply all if I can, which we've since changed because the list is too long. But it was important in the early stages for transparency. And like the Molokai dispatch is where you put a press release. And the flyers, you got to put up flyers apparently, which I didn't realize. Very effective. And then what happens, hopefully we have reached enough people through the dispatch and the flyers and the emails that folks show up. A lot of the amazing stuff that we have been able to accomplish, like the most amazing thing is that most of it has happened over Zoom. We had one in-person meeting in March of 2020, and then everything shifted to being virtual. And somehow we were still able to create a space, a like generative conversation space virtually across an ocean, because I was still living in Fresno. After the March meeting, I flew back to Fresno and was quarantining there. And that was pretty wild. And we just kind of took it one step, like one decision at a time. The goal of the workshops was to both explain like the opportunity, like what space are we designing in? The utility has some constraints around what we can and cannot do, and so explaining that context and then asking the community group the next question in the process of, if we're gonna build a project, who's gonna own it? Okay, let's have that conversation. Here are the different ways things could be owned. What are the considerations they have about ownership? They would ask us questions, we would go research them, we would bring that back. We learned a lot about virtual meetings in terms of like the size of the room, and folks ended up expressing a lot of interest in like breakout rooms that had smaller 4 or 5 people in it that were having a conversation, and then that same like coming back all together and sharing out, so that people who didn't want to speak in front of 25 people in a Zoom room could still share out. That was a really good model for us. And then I think also like being really clear about, if I were a for-profit energy developer that was just developing this project in-house, what decisions would I make alone, or hire a consultant to answer for me? And then just putting those in the public sphere and saying, okay, first we need to find a site. Now that we've decided the thing's going to be owned by a co-op, where is the thing going to be? Okay, now that we've decided where the thing's going to be, well, what kind of panels are there? And doing a little bit of explaining about panels, solar panels, batteries, and then letting the community group ask questions, express what they felt concerned about or had more questions about, and then ultimately kind of narrowing in on the answer to each design question. One of my favorites is calling out specific people, as long as I feel like they're not going to respond poorly to that. So I guess that's part of also relationships in Pulina, is to understand, like, is someone really not interested in being called out? But if they are and they're just waiting for an invitation to do so, I think that has been a helpful strategy for us. Like, hey, Sequoia, I haven't heard you in a while. Do you have anything to share about this? And I would say overall, the group that are the designers, if we are the facilitators and the space makers, the Molokai community, they are the designers and the key decision makers. They have done a great job of kind of defining their own consensus decision making. We've almost never actually voted on anything, because they just talk around to each other, and anybody that has an issue with the majority decision gets heard, and usually that person says, I want option A instead of option B, but I'm willing to go with option B because I want the thing to move forward, which I think is a really different way to oppose something. Like if we were, again, to make the parallel to a for-profit developer, if we were a for-profit developer that chose option B and community member that wanted option A was out there, it's very unlikely that, or it's less likely that that community member would feel any sort of buy-in to option B going forward, because there isn't the level of ownership, the level of like, we want this whole thing to move forward. Even if it doesn't exactly reflect how I individually would design it, but I respect the process that everybody is going through and that like transparency. I feel very impressed with that. I think that we're still learning a lot about like decision making, and maybe also I would put the word efficient decision making in there, because consensus building does take a lot of time. Which I think is really useful, because everybody feels a lot of buy-in for the end product designed, because we talked around it for a really long time and everyone knew every aspect of it, and then we decided to go with that battery, for example, and feels really confident in that battery. But I do think that there's room for improvement for us to help come to a consensus in maybe a faster way that still feels like everyone was acknowledged and contributed. And maybe like if design is that big squiggly thing that goes like this and then peters out to a single line, to a single point, if there's a way that we as facilitators can help hear what everyone had to say, reflect back to them what we heard in summary, and then let them make the last decision, or affirm that what we heard from them was right, or alter what we're reflecting back to them. I think there's a little bit of room for synthesis that we are still building on.